We will be beginning with the introduction of our esteemed panelists who have joined us today for this discussion. This session is composed of presentations and some of the discussions, questions revolving around the topic that we are going to discuss today. With this, let me introduce, first of all, the guest of honor with us, Dr. Philip. He's a Deputy Ambassador to Pakistan from German Embassy. Thank you, sir, for joining us. He's in the mission since 2019. Before that, he has served as the head of division for foreign trade promotion at Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Berlin. And he's also been a deputy head of Consulate General Istanbul, European Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Berlin, and has successfully led many other delegations during his professional career. Unfortunately, due to a cabinet meeting of Hamad Azhar, he could not join us for this panel. So I would like to begin this session with just to provide a little bit of context on what is SDG 7 and what we will be talking about in this session. So as we know that the SDG 7 is to ensure access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy for all, with a substantial increase in the share of renewable energy in the energy mix and increasing the energy efficiency, essential to power economic development and demonstrate commitment towards fighting climate change. A major energy transition has been observed in many countries where the economies are opting for sustainable solutions and for sustainable economic recovery, involving moving away from fossil fuels investment and adoption of renewable energy sources. But there are still some questions about the scale, the timeline, and the adoption of these renewable sources in the context of Pakistan. For example, while the energy sector of Pakistan had already suffered some major inefficiencies and the financial debt, COVID-19 had brought a major impact, particularly in the reduction of demand, financial stress, and disruptions to the power supply chain. So analyzing these impacts on the energy sector is very critical as analyzing the economic sector. At the same time, the pandemic exposed the vulnerability of the country to external shocks, which resulted in deep financial impacts that were faced by the key governments, including government, industries, businesses. We also saw in the initial phase of the lockdown, the reduction in carbon dioxide emissions that provided an opportunity to opt for green, inclusive recovery options and moving towards low carbon, resilient, and inclusive economies. Governments made incentives, stronger policy and fiscal responses to build back better. However, some of the research recently identifies that the countries have fallen short in their commitments to build back better after the pandemic, with just 18% of the announced recovery being spent in the green investment. Given this context, this session particularly aims to explore the potential of economic recovery stimulus and packages for green recovery in Pakistan. And the broader objective is to identify measures to foster an accelerated transition towards clean energy, spurring economic growth, creating jobs, and put emissions into structural decline. With this, I would like to invite the Dr. Philip for his opening remarks, and then we'll move on to the panel discussion with the introduction of the panelists. So, Dr. Philip.
Good afternoon to everybody. Esteemed Dr. Hina, honorable guests, honorable panelists, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and an honor altogether to address you here at this occasion of this panel of SDG Sustainable Development Goal number 7, titled Focus on Green Recovery in Pakistan. The yearly SDPI Conference on Sustainable Development is one of the key events in the policy and research community in Pakistan, attracting both top researchers from all over the world and high-ranking policymakers from Pakistan. The inaugural ceremony at the Presidential Palace yesterday demonstrated clearly the strong support of the government of Pakistan to SDPI and its commitment to implement Sustainable Development Goals in Pakistan. These Sustainable Development Goals of 2015 contain as number 7 the self-commitment of the states around the world to, I quote, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all, end of quotation. According to the United Nations, access to affordable, reliable, modern, and sustainable energy is crucial to achieving many of the Sustainable Development Goals, from poverty eradication via advancement in health, education, water supply, and industrialization to mitigating climate change. Energy access, however, varies widely across countries, and the current rate of progress falls short of what will be required to achieve the goal. Redoubled efforts will be needed, particularly for countries with large energy access deficits and high energy consumption. In its recently submitted National Determined Contributions, NDCs, Pakistan describes its own situation as follows, quotation, large energy supply and demand gap, high basket price of electricity due to the dependence on important sources of energy, a sizable population living below the poverty line, and prevailing water and food insecurity concerns accentuate the need to follow a high economic pathway, growth pathway. Some sentences later, quotation, however, realizing the importance of reducing the greenhouse gases emissions under Paris Agreement to limit the rise of temperatures to 1.5 or maximum 2 degrees, Pakistan aims to reduce the emissions to the maximum possible extent, end of quotation. Consequently, Pakistan has made a clear decision for green and resilient development pathway. By 2030, 60% of all energy produced in the country will be generated from renewable energy resources, including hydro. By the same date, 30% of all new vehicles sold in Pakistan in various categories will be electric vehicles. And from 2020 onwards, a moratorium is in place on new imported coal-based power plants and no generation of power through imported coal. Plans for 2 new coal-fired plants have been shelved in favor of hydroelectric power, and there is increased focus on coal gasification and liquefaction for indigenous coal. In my opinion, these are very ambitious goals on which one has to congratulate Pakistan and offer support where required, where possible, and where necessary. Especially against the background that right now, Pakistan is still heavily dependent on fossil fuels. Natural and regasified, liquefied natural gas add up to more than 30% in Pakistan's energy generation mix, followed by coal with around 20% and oil at 5%. That means there is still a huge gap to overcome to reach the 60% target in renewable energy supply. While hydropower already adds up to almost 30%, wind and solar only make up to 5% in Pakistan's energy mix. The German government stands ready to support Pakistan. At COP26, this was one of the big conferences of this year in Copenhagen, both countries agreed on a common climate and energy initiative with a financial volume of roughly 350 million euros. This includes various loans for hydropower and solar energy, as well as technical advice to scale up energy efficiency and distributions, introducing reforms to trigger private investments. I'm convinced that this panel will have most interesting discussions on pro and cons of these arguments and above all on the timeline. Please allow me to add some food for thought on a private basis. In the last weeks, time and again, we read about the air pollution in Pakistan's big cities, especially in Lahore. On various days, the air of Lahore was the most polluted worldwide, worse than even in New Delhi. Life expectancy in Lahore is 5 years below the Pakistani average due to this pollution, as I was told. Shouldn't this be reason enough to think about changes? For example, to stop providing fuels of minor quality. We also read in newspapers about high costs of importing oil and gas, trade deficit, devaluation of the currency, inflation, and therefore shrinking purchasing power of the people. Pakistani people are directly suffering under global rising energy prices. Especially in poor and rural areas, energy access is insufficient and impedes the people to find a way out of poverty. We even hear about shortages of gas supply in cities during this winter. Wouldn't it be helpful, for example, to use more and more sun power for generating electric energy? Pakistan has abundant sunshine, free of charge, and a lot of empty spaces for solar energy power plants. This panel, I think, is a very good opportunity to bring together policymakers, researchers, and think tanks to discuss lessons learned and to take a joint look into the future. And I'm very much looking forward to the upcoming presentations and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Philip, to set this scene for this panel discussion that is for the need of today, and especially for highlighting the very pertinent issues that we are facing in Pakistan that alarms us to switch to the greener options and transition pathways for better living and better human health. Moving on, I would like to just iterate the first aforementioned point that this session is being organized, is being co-organized with GIZ Pakistan, and we would be hearing on the Energy Transition for Greener Pakistan program from Mr. Ali Zain Banatwala, who is working as a team leader at GIZ RE2 project. He's a holder of MSc in Electrical Engineering from University of Bath and Masters in Finance from London Business School. He has 18 years of experience in the utility industry, including 9 years with German utility. And his expertise lies in the transmission and the distribution networks and grid integration of renewables. So he's the team lead and will be enriching us on the work that GIZ is doing on the clean energy for energy transition for greener Pakistan. We welcome you on the rostrum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hina, and good afternoon to the audience. Good afternoon to the other panelists. As soon as my presentation is up and running, I'll begin. So I don't have the control, so just go to the next page, please. So we'll it's a short presentation, just a little bit about the challenges, some of the things that are happening in Pakistan, and then a potential roadmap, as well as a couple of slides on the Pakistani German Renewable Energy Forum. So as Dr. Philip already mentioned, that expensive imported fossil fuels is a real problem for Pakistan. I think everyone knows about that, and more on that later. What a lot of people don't realize is that the summer cooling load is actually what drives investment in peak capacity. So we hit a national record peak this year, August 10th, at about 10 p.m. and we generated 24,564 megawatts. That was this summer. August 10th. And just today, this morning, we were at 9,000 megawatts. So that just goes to show the difference between the base load and the peak load. Now, in most economies, you have industrial load, commercial load, and residential load roughly split in equal proportions. But here you see that, with 9,000 megawatts, it was today's early morning generation, and with 25,000 in the summer, clearly there's a massive amount of cooling, and that's obviously a huge problem for us. Because to meet that demand, we have to run some really expensive generation. Wind and hydro, of course, wind, solar, and hydro are the mainstays of the future power mix. But of course, wind and hydro especially are located very far away. This is a problem not just for Pakistan, but in general, the world is grappling with this problem: how to bring these clean energy sources to market, to the load centers. Solar net metering, I'll have a slide on this, is growing, but the prosumers, people who use the network to draw electricity at night and then feed electricity back into the network in the day, they actually don't, they're being netted off. So, for example, if you utilize 20 units in the evening, in the nighttime, and then you generate 20 units excess on your roof, and you put that in the network, you're netted off at zero, but you've actually used the network twice for 40 units, 20 to feed in and 20 to extract. But because of the way we charge for our infrastructure, we charge it on a per unit basis. A prosumer like that will have paid nothing. And that cost will have to be picked up by a normal consumer who is only drawing from the network. This again is a problem that the whole world is having to deal with. It's known as the utility death spiral, which essentially means that the utility is unable to cover its fixed expenses and then is relying on a smaller and smaller base of consumers to get that cost recovery. Transmission and distribution networks have been sorely neglected in the past 10 years, where if you read some of the numbers, something like the CIPEC, the Pakistan Economic Corridor, is something like $27 billion worth of energy projects. Out of that, only $2 billion is spent on one transmission line. The rest is all generation. Just to give you an idea, the regulated asset base of the transmission companies is about $1.5 billion, and if you take all the distribution companies together, with the exception of K Electric, apart from them, if you take the other 10 together, that's probably also another 1.5 billion. So for example, FESCO is 300 million. So with just the asset base of the transmission and distribution companies together is just $3 billion. And if you compare the investment and generation of the assets that, again, the consumer has to pay for, it's probably $50 billion in generation. So the transmission and distribution requires a lot of investment. And of course, green financing. There is a state bank scheme for green financing, but it seems to be very, very underutilized, especially for smaller consumers, because they lend to the commercial banks at 2%. The commercial banks lend ahead to consumers at 6%. That's the business model, but the commercial banks want, the credit risk is on them. So they want bank guarantees and all sorts of, collateral. And most people say, forget about it. It's just too much of a pain. So just a quick slide on the generation mix today and where it will be. So as Dr. Philip said, we're at 50% or more of, we're at 25% of renewable energy if you count hydro today, but we expect to go to about 55% by 2030. So those are the two pie charts on the left. And if you see I don't know if it's visible or not, the chart on the right comes from the integrated generation capacity expansion plan. It's a 10-year plan, which basically the tallest bars are 22, 23, and 24. So we expect about almost about 13 or 14,000 megawatts of new generation capacity to come online in the next 3 years. You see that a lot of the next 2 years are black. So those are imported coal. Of course, these were commissioned or at least approved a long time ago. In the middle you see a couple of gray, that those are local coal, Jamshoro Unit 1, that 600, Unit 2 was shelved because of environmental issues. And then you see a lot of blue hydro. In 2025, Yasa 1000, which is supposed to be 1,000 megawatts Kachik hydro, but since the Afghan government has declared force majeure, that probably won't happen. But you see a lot of yellow and you see a lot of green. At least it seems green here. Those are the solar committed solar projects over the next 3 years, and then after that, those are all candidate solar and candidate wind, which essentially means that when the transmission planning and the generation planning was being done last year, it was or earlier this year, sorry, it was already realized that the solar and wind are the cheapest forms of energy generation. As I said, bringing those energy resources to the load centers is a real challenge. So the government intends to hold capacity auctions for wind and solar in the next few years, maybe 1,000 megawatts each year starting 2023. But as you can see, the sites are very far away from the load centers. On the left, you see that in the Chaghi hills in Balochistan, we have very good resource, wind and solar, both excellent capacity factors, but it's in Western Balochistan. So, apart from the security issues, there is no network there. So you'd have to build 500 kilometers worth of transmission lines just to bring that to the load centers. Similarly, in Jampir, we have, in March, we'll have something close to 2,000 megawatts of wind installed, but with a lot more capacity, but already the transmission network is overloaded over there. So that's a real challenge. How do we bring these resources which are clean and green and super cheap, but unfortunately not connected to the rest of the network? We need to invest in transmission. This is a slide just meant to show how fast solar net metering is growing. By net metering, I mean rooftop solar PV. And as you can see, over the last couple of years, we've had an exponential increase. And in just this year alone, well, before this year, we had a total of 120 megawatts across all the distribution networks. And in this year alone, this is till the first 9 months, we had an addition of 148 megawatts. So we had more additions this year than we had in all years previous. And this trend is going to continue. Go ahead, please. But this is an example of why solar net metering is a double-edged sword. I already mentioned the fact that that they don't, prosumers under the current model do not pay for the network usage. NEPRA, the energy regulator, asked the GIZ, our EEE project, to conduct a techno-economic assessment of single-phase net metering. For those who don't know, net metering in Pakistan is currently restricted to 3-phase connections, and those are less than 10% of all connections. So in the interest of democratization of energy, it's important to allow single-phase consumers to also be able to feed into the network if they have excess energy. However, you see from these charts, maybe the chart on the left shows you that because they're single-phase, you may have more installations on some one phase and less on the other. And we commissioned a study by Lahore University of Management Sciences, taking the ISCO network as an example, and just to study what happens when you have a single phase net metering. So the chart on the left shows the voltage imbalance, and the chart on the right shows what would happen if you have 25 or even up to 50% net metering. You can see that in March, on a typical day in March, anything beyond 20%, you would actually have negative power demand. So ISCO would actually be injecting power into the transmission network. So a roadmap, net metering policy needs to have some mechanism for cost recovery from prosumers. This is very important. Up until now, the IGSEP, the Generation Expansion Plan, was only focused on generation cost. However, since our hydros are in the very north and some of our coal plants are in the middle of the desert, it was important to have the transmission and distribution costs also included. So it doesn't help you if your cost of generation is 8 rupees, if your transmission, it costs you $2 billion to build a transmission line, then maybe that cost, that project isn't justified. Storage is something that is being talked about all over the world, and it's important to look into that. We have conducted a study for the Alternate Energy Development Board, which will be released soon on our website as well. And that'll be there for you to see. Legacy investments, how to deal with that. Hopefully the friends in Germany can support on that. And of course, I think Sardar Muazzam will talk about the megawatts or energy efficiency and how that can improve the cooling load. Just at the end, just a quick word on the Pakistani German Renewable Energy Forum. We are providing technical assistance. We are providing capacity building from German experts, German companies, and most importantly, to the distribution companies, to the public sector. But most importantly, we are trying to bring German businesses and Pakistani businesses, the private sector together, the academia together, and other institutions together to take this journey together. So we conduct working groups as well. If you're interested in these, please get in touch with us, and we'll have you. We'd love to have your participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ali, for a wonderful presentation, and especially highlighting the roadmap for the energy transition in Pakistan, and also introducing us to the Pakistan German Renewable Energy Forum. With this, I would like to invite Mr. Michael Williamson, Section Chief Energy Division from United Nations Economic Social Commission on Asia Pacific, who's going to talk about the broader work on green recovery and building back better, and narrowing down to the context of Pakistan. So we welcome you, Simon. I hope you're doing well. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Hina. It's a great pleasure to join the conference, and greetings to everybody in Pakistan, and congratulations to SDPI for putting on a great hybrid event with many different panels and presentations. It's always an interesting conference, and I think every year we learn a little bit more about Pakistan's sustainable development journey. I'm just going to share my slides, and I'd be grateful, Hina, if you could just let me know if you can see them at the moment. Let me just check if you can see the slides okay. Okay, I'm assuming you can see the slides without problem. So let me launch into the presentation. I guess this question of the green recovery is not specific to Pakistan. Many countries across the Asia Pacific are dealing with this issue. And in one sense, maybe it's the second time or perhaps the third time that the region has grappled with this issue. Most recently in 2008, the financial crisis of 2008-2009 was perhaps an example of when we didn't have a green recovery. It was generally a high carbon recovery from that particular crisis. But this time around, there are a lot of reasons why it can be different. And I'll go into some of those a little bit in the presentation. So the key messages that I'd like to share is that, you know, both Pakistan and the Asia Pacific region have substantial financing gaps in the SDGs and moreover in the climate response in order to fulfill the requirements of the Paris Agreement and climate change. But the green recovery from COVID-19, as I think all of the speakers in this panel will be saying, it's needed to meet both the economic recovery and the climate and sustainability goals. And if we look at the benefits, we see there are significant co-benefits that we can leverage from the green economy. So focusing in on SDG 7, I'm drawing here on an ESCAP publication called the Survey, that's short for the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific. So in 2009, this document prepared some cost estimates of what we need to meet SDG 7. In other words, what is the annual investment required you can see it's quite a lot. We need in renewables over 240 billion, 180 billion in energy efficiency, in access to electricity, 10 billion, and 2 billion in clean cooking solutions. So these are quite large investment needs. And in fact, if we look at this a slightly different way, so that the SDG 7 funding gap is on the right-hand side here in blue. If we look at just the renewables part, we're investing a lot in renewables in the Asia Pacific, but it's not going to be enough to meet the funding gap. But the important point is that fossil fuel subsidies are enormous, and it's a strange phenomenon because if you look at the data across the region, they seem to vary quite a bit from year to year. Obviously, 2020 was less fossil fuel subsidies paid by governments of the region, probably because energy demand was down across the board. But fossil fuel subsidies have been in the crosshairs for several years now. Most recently, I think in the COP26, if you look at the COP26 declaration, it proposed to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. And the G20 similarly have had a similar resolution at the G20 level. So if you add up the fossil fuel subsidies on top of existing investment in renewables, it's easy to see how you can quickly bridge these kinds of gaps. I could have put some Pakistan-specific data here in terms of fossil fuel subsidies, but I didn't want to go through all of the metrics in Pakistan. What I would want to say quite quickly is that if you look at the league table of fossil fuel subsidies globally, in terms of dollars of subsidy per GDP, Pakistan is not particularly high on the list. In fact, it's somewhere on the lower half. So I'm not suggesting that this is a pervasive issue in Pakistan. But let me focus for a little bit on investment in coal and this idea of trying to avoid this high carbon recovery. Because if you look at investing in coal, as many countries in the Asia Pacific are doing in response to the need to meet increased demand for electricity, we have a particular problem. And that problem is locked in generations. In other words, if we look at the existing coal-fired power fleet, the operating, which is this dark color here, even if we were to stop building coal today, we still have emissions right out to 2060. And this is because coal-fired power plants tend to live for a very long time in the energy system. They can be around for 40 years or sometimes more. So phasing out fossil fuel, phasing out emissions by mid-century implies a very rapid drawdown, not just of the pipeline, but also of the existing fleet. And if we look at this other graph here on the right-hand side, the horizontal yellow bar here is where we need to be in terms of the Paris Agreement benchmarks to limit global warming. So you can see that even the current coal-fired generation fleet in Asia Pacific exceeds the emissions where we need to be. So this cap comes down in 2030 and lower down in 2040. So it's implying that by 2040, we need to have phased out coal completely from the region's energy systems. And I think this highlights one of the risks of investing in high carbon infrastructure. This is a publication that we put together earlier this year in partnership with Climate Analytics. And I've provided the QR code if you want to have a read of it. But it really highlights the point that Asia Pacific is the global region that's driving not just the current use of coal, but particularly the future use of coal. So in other words, the planned coal-fired power stations, 94% of them are in the Asia Pacific region. I'm happy to say that number is probably different now. This analysis is a couple of months old. We've had a lot of very encouraging announcements from governments of the region who have mothballed some of these coal-fired proposals, including Pakistan. So in terms of this time around, I mentioned that this is not the first time we've gone through this exercise, but I think COVID-19 is a much more profound shock than any of us have had in living memory. And accordingly, the economic recovery needs to be much more concerted and a lot more effort to get the economies back to where they need to be. But looking at the data to date, and this is some data collected by my colleagues in the macroeconomic policy and financing division of SCAP, looking at the kind of limited data that's emerging so far in terms of the policies that countries have put in place, it could have been greener. So if we look at the policies here by country, this is just the number of policy measures which are related to green. This, for example, conservation of wildlife protection, nature-based solutions, or subsidies for green products as a couple of examples. You know, we have a couple of countries which have a series of these policies, but in fact, that is countermanded by the number of policy measures that hinder green recovery. So on balance, if you had to make a judgment, you would say it's looking more like a brown recovery than a green recovery at the moment. So this kind of decision-making calculus has to be addressed quite urgently. So I'd like to just introduce this idea of building forward better. We've heard the term building back better. We've used that in the Sendai Declaration on disaster risk reduction, but building forward better implies a slightly different approach. And this is where the green recovery really comes in. And SCAP has done a little bit of modeling, which I hope to show you some of the highlights in a minute, about some of the advantages of a green policy package. And this framework, if you will, has got these three elements. It's about, in the middle, of course, we have building forward better, but it's about providing better digital access to citizens, to improve the education, access to information, but also importantly, paperless trade. It includes also green development and also social services, the social protection, providing social safety nets and meeting the needs of informal workers. So these are the kind of the three pillars upon which the building forward better concept is built. So in terms of the green development part of it, it looks at spending increases in key areas to support ecosystem restoration and investment in clean energy. It proposes a carbon tax, of course, which in the first couple of slides. So there are several channels of impact. I think there are three channels really. One is on clean energy and climate resilient infrastructure, which is really this investment in clean energy. The second is carbon price, and the third is biodiversity. So looking at things like ecosystems in our macroeconomic policy and finance division, we would also see a corresponding reduction in the debt, increase in debt to GDP ratio. But if we look at things such as carbon emissions, it can bend the curve on carbon emissions and reduce air quality, reduce air pollution, as we heard the ambassador speak about in his opening remarks. So there are a lot of benefits in this green economy beyond simply the economic recovery. So in terms of decarbonizing the economy, just focusing a little bit on this carbon tax issue. And of course, it's not necessarily a carbon tax. It could be other types of carbon pricing schemes. It's an opportunity to raise revenue. And according to the modeling, you can see the revenue as a percentage of GDP across the different countries modeled, and accordingly, what sort of reduction in carbon emissions you would achieve. And about 2 years ago, the Secretary General of the United Nations made a statement in which he said it's time to tax pollution, not profits. And really, if you look at the opportunities in taxing carbon, it's not just about providing the price signals and reducing emissions, it's also about resource mobilization and creating some of the fiscal space needed to recover from shocks such as COVID. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for such an insightful presentation, especially for highlighting building for better, bringing both economic and environmental benefits, decarbonization of the economies, and phasing down coal. With this, I would like to quickly move on to our next speaker before we move on to the panel discussion. So we have Mr. Simon Miller with us. He's a director at Agora think tank, Germany. He's heading the Agora's Germany work on overarching issues of energy and climate policy, as well as in the areas of electricity, heat, and energy infrastructure. In around 10 years as an energy transition expert, Simon has advised governments in over 20 countries on 6 continents and coordinated and written a large number of studies on converting the electricity and energy systems to renewables. Let's hear from Simon on what he has for energy transition in Pakistan. Over to you, Simon.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever you might be watching this event. Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation. For those of you who are not familiar with Agora Energiewende's work, we are a Berlin-based think tank with quite a considerable amount of international work as well. And our mission is to provide fact-based analysis and practical policy recommendations in order to achieve climate neutrality in a sustainable way. And what I will be sharing with you in the following minutes are some considerations on how to adapt planning processes that will be ultimately the conclusion of the presentation. But in order to appropriately set the scene, I will share some of the recent developments in Germany around how to achieve climate neutrality. And I think the very big shift that we're looking at is that while renewables have been largely a story about the electricity sector, and of course we see a very remarkable dynamic in the electricity sector that brings its own challenges, and we already heard about these in previous presentations. The new thing is that now it really is about having a system, an energy system-wide and economy-wide approach. And actually, there's a number of opportunities in taking such an approach. I will now share my screen. I hope you can see the slides and move forward to the first substantive slide. So this is a study, the summary is available in English, towards a climate neutral Germany 2045. That looked at a path towards climate neutrality for Germany altogether. It was published earlier in 2021, and in fact, it was somewhat of a coincidence that it came exactly in the moment when the German Constitutional Court said, well, Germany needs to adapt its climate legislation, and the results of this scenario have now been, in some cases, very closely converted into the current national law in Germany. Now, what does this look like? The target you see here in 2045. I don't have a pointer here right now. Let me see whether I can find one. Otherwise, I'll just direct your attention to, it's the right corner of this blue rectangle. So in 2035, you see that in total, we are at -2 million tons of CO2 emissions. There's some remainder of still emissions that are inevitable, not avoidable, but they're compensated by other emissions, by negative emissions. And you see, actually, we need a reduction not just in the energy sector, which is largely the electricity sector. You can see that here in the bottom. And of course, it's the biggest component historically. It still is, and it's a very important field of action. But also we see the industrial sector needing to become fully climate neutral, the building sector, transport, agriculture, and waste. And actually, the emissions that are hardest to get rid of in the long run are the emissions on the one hand from agriculture. There it's in particular certain types of cattle. And of course, in the industry, there is process emissions. So for example, in cement manufacturing. Now, this really is a system that is based on a paradigm shift. Classically, we have energy-rich molecules. These are usually fossil molecules that we use to convert to electricity. And in a climate neutral system that really takes the benefit of low cost renewables, what really happens is we have a reversal. We have electrons, renewable electricity that now not only makes electricity, but also energy rich molecules. And in order to do this, you need quite a substantial increase in the production capacity of renewable electricity. Now, for those of you who are not so familiar with the German system, to put these numbers into context, we currently have roughly 80 gigawatts of peak demand. This goes up somewhat slightly, but you see there's still a very large multiple of the peak demand as installed capacity, simply because with the variable renewables, you use flexibility in order to use the electricity then when it's available, it's abundant and cheap. And you need some smart ideas on how to either consume it directly, that's usually the cheapest way and most efficient, or where this is not possible, to store it for later. Now, every country will have its own circumstances. This is geared towards the circumstances in Germany, where, for example, you have a pretty strong seasonality, both of the availability of wind, solar, but of course also of the demand. And in this case, this scenario looks also at the public acceptance component. And here, the role of land-based wind is somewhat lower because the land availability in Germany is not so vast as it can be in other countries. But of course, wind doesn't have a strong seasonality in Germany, somewhat in winter, but not so strong. Of course, there's other countries, depending on the climate, where it can be reversed, where solar is more stable and wind is more seasonal. So the main message of this slide is the role of renewable electricity becomes much larger. You need a lot more capacity for two reasons: because you meet new electricity demand, and because it's variable sources, you build them at a higher capacity anyway. Now, what are some of the applications where this abundance of renewable electricity can go? What we see here is in the industrial sector an increase, so electrified process heat, electricity-based steam production, but of course also heat pumps where you use low temperature. Then, of course, the electrification of transport, more electric vehicles. And then here in buildings, of course, it's Germany where you have winter heating demand. Conversely, you would here have efficient air conditioning in countries where the cooling requirement is higher. And then here on the top, you see the production of hydrogen. Now, this is important in a double sense. It can be used to meet those demands that cannot be directly electrified. So, for example, steel production is the prime example where you need something to take out the oxygen from the iron ore. Classically, this has been carbon, a C. So if you add the oxygen, you have CO2. So that's the problem. And how do you solve it? Via the direct reduction of iron. There you can use hydrogen, so H2. And when you then take out the oxygen, you have H2O. This is simply water vapor, so not a problem. Now, this led up, this was set the scene essentially for the planning processes. And what are the implications now? First, you still need the power system planning for high shares of wind and solar. And now this will be a little bit technical. In the past, you could largely disregard the very detailed operation of the power plants. It was sufficient to categorize them into the peaking capacity, mid-merit capacity, baseload capacity. Baseload running around the clock, mid-merit maybe running twice a day, or seasonally when there's higher demand, and then the peaking capacity really only for those days where you have very high demand. Now, you still need dispatchable capacity in a power system on wind and solar. This can come from batteries. It really depends on the availability and the demand structure. But what's crucial is wind and solar are part-time workers. So when they are present, the other generation needs to make room. And when they are absent, you need other ways to meet the electricity demand. It can be innovative flexibility like storage that is becoming increasingly cost competitive. It can be the flexible operation of existing assets as well. Now, when you plan this, the main message is the long-term planning needs to take a closer look on how the system operates from hour to hour. It sometimes even needs to take an even closer look to look at system stability issues. So new planning tools are required. I also saw that some of the rooftop PV has already been growing dynamically. So what will happen to distribution grids? So the interaction between distribution grid planning and transmission grid planning also becomes more relevant. Spatially, so from a geographic perspective, you also need to look at the system not as one thing, which is often done in power system planning, but rather segment it into regions so that you see what are some of the transmission demands. We heard it in one of the previous presentations, hydro and wind being more remote. So how do you actually solve this problem in a way, just to give an example? So what is the right amount of transmission there? Now, this here, the world has now been doing for many years. We know how it works largely, but this stuff now is new. The power sector is becoming the basis of the entire energy system. So there's exactly this reversal that I already mentioned. That we use electricity for the energy-rich molecules. And what does that mean? Now, system planning for climate neutrality is more demanding, but in many ways also even more interesting. First, you need to think about what will the load profiles be for direct electrification. I'm sure you're having these discussions about how will electromobility impact the system? How will vehicles charge? Will they charge when solar PV is available in the middle of the day? What does it mean for the planning of charging infrastructure? But also, if we move towards hydrogen, when will the electrolyzers run? Where will they be sited? Can we site them where the hydro and the wind is available? And then maybe we transport the hydrogen instead of the electricity. Will that be cheaper? So this is an important question, but also now the connection to international markets. Will you import some of the hydrogen and its derivatives, maybe ammonia? So what you need is an integrated modeling of the power sector, considering heat, gas, and the transport system. I think we have some international examples that this can be done, but actually also the experts in Germany largely are students of this subject. And it's a collective effort that we need globally to upgrade these planning processes and have active dialogues and what we can learn from each other. So I hope this was an interesting input, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Simon, right on time. It was a great presentation sharing an overview of new planning requirements and approaches to power system planning and operations in Germany, and also highlighting some of these strategies for carbon neutrality, such as electrification in the transport, heat, and the other sectors. So thank you so much for your intervention. With this, I would like to move on to the panel discussion. And we have our esteemed panelists with us. Dr. Sardar Mohsen, he's a Managing Director, NECA, National Energy Conservation Authority. Then we have Mr. Syed Mushtaba Hussain. He's a Senior Joint Secretary, International Cooperation, Ministry of Climate Change. And we have Mr. Hartmut, Coordinator, Pakistan, Germany, Climate Energy Initiative at GIZ, Pakistan. So I would like to also request Dr. Sardar to be the chair for this session. And I would like to begin with you in terms of moving on to the role of the public sector and being at the forefront of the government's initiatives on the energy efficiency with regards to the conservation initiatives. From your personal experience and the analysis, what is the way forward for green recovery in Pakistan, and what are the aspects of our energy operational paradigm need improvement to enhance the energy efficiency? So Dr. Sardar, you can use your, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Hina. I think before I talk about what some of these points being pointed towards me, I think this is a very interesting thing to highlight, that whatever the Ali has said and some of these other panelists or the speakers have already mentioned about it, they are very interesting points. I think they have rightly diagnosed the challenge. Especially in some of the points which has been highlighted by Ali, that the demand and the supply, especially in winter and summer. And it's not just for electricity. If you look for the gas sector as well, So we all have the challenge on that side that in winter we have shortage of a gas. In summer, we are struggling with electricity. And then in off-peak days, the whole system design is toward the peak days. And in off-peak, we are struggling with the capacity payments and that kind of challenge. So I think this is one of the key things that how we are actually planning the systems, how we are actually dealing with all these sort of challenges. So I think this is one point which I will just leave and later on come back and discuss, like what can be the solution, how we can address, and what can be the future plans. I think that is very important thing. I think one aspect which needs to be addressed here, that understanding of the SDGs 7 especially in the context of Pakistan. And there has already been work conducted, and I remember with the Planning Commission, Sustainable Energy for All action plan was prepared. Three main aspects when we talk about is energy access, renewable energy, and then doubling the share of energy efficiency and conservation. That was the three main pillars. I think whatever the source is of the energy, the primary assumption for any economic development, economic recovery, or any sustainable development, the primary aspect will be always access. That if we can provide 100% access to energy to all, and that access is the key question which we have to address across the board in all the resource distribution that we are working on. Now, how much we can replace the access point with renewables? That is the second question. The more, the better. And I think the third, which SDG 7 specifically highlights, is that how we can sort of use the gigawatts, that is linking us towards energy efficiency, that instead of generating 1 unit of energy, saving 1 unit of energy is much better. So this requires a lot of a behavioral change. This requires a lot of design and pricing and a lot of awareness. And that part plays a very important role. Now, moving in this side, I think if you look at the previous history of the energy sector of Pakistan, there has been one major challenge. We have always focused on generation side. As Ali already mentioned, like look at the investment on transmission and distribution, and look at the investment in the generation side. So you will see that the generation has been always dominated. And what happens on the transmission and distribution side? Now, I'll take it to the step further. What happens on demand management side? What happens on the energy efficiency and conservation side, which is the gigawatt I'm talking about? So on the energy landscape in the country or overall planning paradigm, which we have been following from decades, there has been no discussion on the demand side. How effectively we can do the demand management part. So just to add this, I think if we talk about the demand management, there are a number of ways that the issue of seasonality, which I just started with, that the summer and winter seasons, when there is a peak demand for gas in winters and electricity is so low, but we still have to pay for the capacity payment because of the way we signed these agreements. So I think what will be the future entails from this, how we can solve this kind of situations. So primarily, I think the silver bullet in that case is energy efficiency or demand side management, which has never been done before. So it's not something I think new to the world that we are trying to deal with. This has been done in different parts of the world, the voluntary agreements on energy efficiency with industry, with different commercial facilities, that has been already done. So all you do is to deal with the peak shaving, and the base load still remains with the planners that they have to deal with it. So I think primarily understanding of the system, and as Dr. Hina sort of asked this question, what is the way forward? So the way forward is how we can sort of think through this whole system, how we can redesign this whole system. And that is one way forward with available with us. One. I think another basic challenge which we call as a green economic recovery. And I think especially when we talk about it, there are a very simple study, I think SDPI has already conducted this research, that if you put $1 into the fossil fuels, you generate one job. If you put $1 into the renewable energy, you create 7.2 jobs. And if you put $1 into the energy efficiency, you create 7.5 jobs. So if the goal is the economic recovery, more employments, more opportunities. So I think this gives us this sense that how much is needed. Imagine if we construct a one power plant, maybe it's a big ticket item, more visible, and you get a big claim on this in newspapers, but how much job at the end of the day it will create. And if on a very simple thing, if we start anything on the net metering part or energy audits or any of these things from energy efficiency or renewable standpoint of view, this will be sort of a fiscal incentive across the board. And this will create a lot more jobs than we even can anticipate. And I think the new world, the way we look into the different regulations coming in the West and other parts, energy efficiency or the renewables is more of an, especially if I talk about efficiency part, is more of coming as or deal in financial aspect as an asset, which helps us a lot. So I think this is the overall context where I feel overall from the government's experience that this is where we stand. And I think this is the understanding that has been already, were struggling or we were looking inside the government, like what is the way forward? Now, second, institutionally, we have already worked on these things. This organization, which I am currently heading, National Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority, I think with the support of government, there are a number of things have started. And especially now the policy draft is ready for consultation. And the future that we look into is all about that moving in this direction, that how we can couple renewable energy and energy efficiency for the green transition. And I must say that in this part, currently GIZ is also supporting NICA as well, in terms of the buildings energy efficiency and energy management systems. And there is a lot of these further areas where we think that a lot more can be done. So overall, there has been setting of targets. And I think these target setting and achieving them over this period of time will be something that we will be looking forward. And I think a greater
in terms of interlinking the SDGs and how one SDG, achieving SDG 7 could contribute to achieving poverty reduction, to increase job, to have more job creation and have more employment creation. And also the focus on how we could have a behavioral change in the energy conservation and coupling it with renewable energy could lead us to the energy transition. So thank you so much for providing us useful insights for the way forward for Pakistan. Moving on, I would like to ask Mr. Mushtaba on in terms of what is the development trajectory of the Ministry of Climate Change to achieve the SDG, and also in a broader setting and in line with the PM's vision on clean energy Pakistan. How do you see Pakistan building capacity towards achieving SDG 7 based on the previous learnings and experiences? So,
First of all, I would like to thank SDPI for this discussion on a very important topic regarding achievement of SDG 7. And as we all have seen, very interesting presentations from the perspective of going the greener path in terms of the energy switch towards renewables. So I would like to take the discussion in another direction, that is investing in nature, what we call the nature-based solutions. And from our discussion so far in terms of our policy direction towards it, or coming up with the strategy, the pathway leading towards mitigating or adapting to climate change, what the government has recognized is that unless and until you invest in nature, the global ambition, the goal that has been prescribed in the Paris Agreement, it would practically not be possible to reach that dimension. So in that perspective, I would like to highlight here, and thank you to Dr. Philip, in terms of highlighting some of the salient features of our nationally determined contributions. But one thing I would like to stress here is that Pakistan was probably one of the very few countries in the COP26 negotiations where it has presented a very strong NDC. By strong NDC I mean that the debate which was going towards achieving the global ambition was looking at 2050, 2060, or 2070, where probably not many of us would be alive by that time. And if we have to look towards, meeting the challenge in terms of, benefiting our recent generation, so the focus should have been right now. It is this decade where the focus, the climate change debate should have gone. But what we have presented at COP was the timeline of 2030. And in that perspective, what we have highlighted in the NDCs is to reduce the GHG emissions by 50%. 35% of that would be contingent upon provision of climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building, which all along the climate change debate, in terms of the point of view of developing countries, has remained the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So that is in fact the principle that not only Pakistan but the rest of the developing world has stood along in terms of their point of view in the climate debate. So 15% of those reductions are in fact from our voluntary resources. And mind you, that under the current circumstances where our economic situation is not that good, and that has been further compounded by the COVID thing. So that is something which the government has made a very bold step when it presented its NDC. And the second thing is going the renewable pathway, which has been highlighted here, that the government has again targeted 2030, and 60% of our energy mix would be tilted towards renewables. And apart from that, what Ministry of Climate Change, Government of Pakistan has taken another initiative in terms of steering the e-vehicle policy, where 30% of the vehicles would be electric vehicles. Again, the timeline is 2030. Apart from that, I would like to highlight that during the COVID pandemic era, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, in fact, announced green economic stimulus. So this was, in fact, a direction that the Prime Minister took towards introducing green jobs. By green jobs, I mean all those jobs which were lost during the COVID era. In fact, the project, the 10 billion tree tsunami program, which has categorically focused not only on the
afforestation part, but forest regeneration also. And by bringing in the youth, looking at our youth bulge, and also the other vulnerable sector, that is women folk, become a part of this green stimulus package. And so far what the government has done is it has already introduced 85,000 jobs from the 10 billion tsunami project, and it will be further scaled up to 200,000 green jobs when this government will complete its term. Apart from that, what the government is trying to launch is a kind of a nature performance bond. This is something very new. It has never been piloted anywhere, and it has been seen with a lot of interest from a number of countries. So it will be a market-based transaction based on relaxation in terms of the principal amount and the coupon amount. So this is another initiative that the government is foreseeing at the moment, and we are in the process of discussions with our bilateral development partners, Germany being one, who have joined apart from the other two development partners, UK and Canada, in terms of assisting the government in designing this initiative and launching it also. So with these words, I would say that, as already highlighted, that unless and until we invest in nature and looking at the greener pathway, apart from the energy transition area, we would not be actually meeting the challenge of climate change in terms of adapting and mitigating of the issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Leading on to all these government of Pakistan's initiatives, with bilateral partners, as you mentioned, Germany, I would like to quickly move on in the interest of time to Hartmut on his insights about this Pakistan-German climate energy initiative that has just been launched at the COP. So what are you envisioning? What are the main features, and how can Pakistan be supported through this program? Thank you.
Nina, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel, and thank you very much for providing me the word. Thank you very much for really organizing this great panel here. So for coming back to the Pakistan-German Climate and Energy Initiative, this is one of 6 energy initiatives which have been initiated by the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation around the world. The German the ministry is cooperating with more than 120 countries on the world. Pakistan was one of 6 to whom it was offered. It is the first for which it was inaugurated. So we are walking on new grounds, and we are walking together on new grounds. And I think in this energy sector, we have a huge opportunity. And that's what we see from our side as well. Pakistan is really devoted now to go forward in the energy transition. Pakistan really has the will to move forward. In the international scene, we see we all have to go together. If we don't go together, we will not be able to really fight against climate change. We have 4 challenges. The one challenge is really the energy transition. And I'm very thankful that we so much heard today about the energy transition. The next is really the transport. We heard about the electric mobility. The third, which we have to tackle, is agriculture, and how to really resolve the conflict between food security and emissions in the agricultural sector. And the last is the deforestation, where we run a little bit about in the same direction. Now, we heard today that we have a lot of options on the hand of moving forward in the energy transition. And that's where I think we are partners, Germany and Pakistan, and and we will go together. That's what is meant for this initiative, to really tackle this subject. We are on the best way in the moment, and in this respect, I'm very happy to be here. I have to learn a lot about Pakistan. I arrived here just on the 5th of September. It was very exciting the first month. Now it's getting a bit cold, but it will become much more exciting very soon as it's April. And we have a lot of opportunities, and we as GIZ, we will also offer a lot of opportunities. I like to really point your attention to the climate finance, and especially the opportunities we will receive now with the green bonds. And this we really can put together. Just to give you one figure. Currently, every year, the amount of green bonds on the market is doubling, almost doubling. But the demand for green bonds is much higher than the emissions. So here just to highlight one big opportunity. That's what I wanted to highlight for today. So let's go together hand in hand for the next years and do the best out of it. One last sentence. The big challenge for Pakistan is in really leaving no one behind. Because if we manage this energy transition with social equilibrium, we will succeed. If not, we will have big problems. Thank you. We are together.
Thank you so much, Hartmut. Very enlightening for all of us, and I'm extremely thankful to all the esteemed speakers and the panelists who have joined us today for this great discussion. And I'm very glad and pleased to share that the discussion has been fruitful in terms of we had the right representation and perspective from the public sector, from the development partners, from the private stakeholders, the think tanks, the civil societies. And now moving on at the end, the last session is the academic, where we have two young scholars who will be presenting their studies on green recovery. Firstly, I would like to invite Ms. Kinza Nadeem. She's a graduate student at Fatima Jinnah Women University, Rawalpindi. And she'll be presenting her study on green total factor productivity, environmental policies, and fiscal decentralization in Pakistan. And the other scholar we have is Mr. Muhammad Zulfikar, who will be following Kinza after the presentation. Just to be mindful of the time, we would really appreciate if the presentation could be around 5 minutes, and we can take on to taking questions from the audience. Thank you so much.
Everyone. Decentralization is the transmission of responsibility for management, organizing, and resources allocation from central government to local, as well as provisional governments. And there are various ways for government to delegate authority to subnational level. And decentralization can be administrative, political, and fiscal. Administrative decentralization is a transmission of responsibility for planning and management of certain public functions from central to local governments. Okay. Political decentralization relates to the transfer of function or authority from central government to local government that are governed by the local political representations. And fiscal decentralization is the transmission of responsibility for revenue and expenditures to provisional and local government. And the idea of fiscal decentralization is provided by Heck in 1942, who noted that the fiscal decentralization increased the economic effectiveness in the provisions of public sectors. On the other hand, total factor productivity, called as ratio among real factor inputs and real products, was first presented by Tinberg in 1945. Neoclassical growth theory explained TFP as an improvement in technology, and the green TFP not only enlarged the meaning of TFP, but also enhanced the computing factor of TFP, such as ecological environment. CO2 is the universal leading greenhouse gas emission, and it accounts 58% of overall greenhouse gases and is fostering negative impact on the environment. A number of environmental regulations and environmental policies have been laid out by successive governments to handle the issues effectively, like National Conservation Strategy 1992, Environmental Protection Act 1997, National Conservation Policy 2005, and Billion Tree Tsunami 2014. Okay, objectives of the study is to compute the sectoral green TFP for manufacturing sector of Pakistan during 1975 to 2019. and to determine the role of fiscal decentralization and environmental regulation affecting the sectoral green TFP along with other leading factors including institutional quality, trade openness, industrial structure, and energy consumption. Okay, methodology. Here is our baseline equation. The dependent variable is sectoral green TFP and independent include fiscal decentralization, square term of fiscal decentralization, and D represent the three environmental dummies that are National Conservation Strategy 1992, Environmental Protection Act 1997, and National Conservation Policy 2005. And X represent the four control variables, that is institutional quality, industrial structure, trade openness, and energy consumption. And for the computation of sectoral green TFP, we have used the growth accounting method, and the data source of all the variables are your Book of Labor Statistics, Economic Surveys, Handbook of Statistics, WDI, and Center for Symmetric Peace. And the estimation technique is a fully modified ordinary least square. The computed green TFP presented in figure 1 shows a highly fluctuating trend for given time period, but that remained in margin line. The trend is gradually increasing and then decreasing, showing a non-linear trend. For few years, the productivity growth is even in negative zone. According to Chaudhary 2005, the manufacturing sector, the productivity of manufacturing sector is increased by 2.4% from 1985 to 2005, where capital was the major contributor. Okay, these are the regression result. Table 1 presented augmented equivalent test result in which all the variables are stationary at first difference. This allows us to proceed with FMOLS applications. These are the FMOLS estimates. Our main independent variable is fiscal decentralization, which appears to be positively significant, and the square term is appears to be negatively significant, which means that the excessive level of decentralization is discourage the green productivity, and institutional quality also appears to be positively significant, and our two dummies D2 and D3 are also positively significant, which means that the green TFP may encourage the green productivity. And diagnostic test we have also applied, which validate the presence of long-run relationship among the variables. Okay, we have also found the nonlinearity in physical decentralization and sectoral green TFP relationship. Figure 2 present the optimal value of fiscal decentralization with the average value, in which we see that in 1985, 1995, and 2010, the average value is below the optimal value, and the optimal value is around 56%. Okay, next is the policy suggestion. It is suggested to adopt the moderate level of fiscal decentralization along with the rigorous and consistent implementation of environmental protection policies in Pakistan, and the control of institutional quality and diversion of resources toward environmental preservation at subnational level can promises a sustainable future for Pakistan. Thank you.
Great presentation. So we have the abstract who is available online, but the full paper I will be published later on, and we will be sharing with the stakeholders. So the next we have Mr. Zulfikar, who will be joining us. He'll be presenting his paper. So,
I'm really thankful to the SDPI team and GIZ for organizing this panel. I really appreciate all the amazing work which have been done by this team, especially for the energy sector, for the sustainability. The topic which I am going to discuss is basically financial viability of waste to energy conversion process in green recovery of Pakistan. When we discuss about the green recovery of Pakistan, the main significant pillars which come out for any country like Pakistan is to give energy access to 50 million population, which is living without of it. And the recovery plan is that should be also economical, sustainable. And also we basically focus on the environmental impact. Okay, how the way we are using basically is this environmentally, is it polluting or not? It should be for the sustainability and implementing for the energy. And what the recently COVID taught us that the energy sector is basically linked with all the SDGs, the sustainable development goals like health and education. The power infrastructure in rural areas is very weak, like for the causing challenges for the cold chains. So the bioenergy can address all these critical issues. The main research, the aim and the research objectives are basically, there are three. One is we will discuss about the feedstock assessment for the bioenergy potential. And the second one is basically the assessment of biotechnology, bioenergy technologies, which will be the mainly discussed in this presentation. How can we assess about the technology, the assessment which is based on LCOE, levelized cost of electricity. And the next one is basically which are the major barriers towards the bioenergy deployment and policy pathway for its penetration in energy mix of Pakistan, like which is the roadmap. Here you can see that if we discuss about the LCOE levelized cost of electricity, like when we are going towards any technology, it is basically having a capital cost, some other variable cost, fixed cost, including all those costs for this technology plant. So it is basically the concept of LCOE is that how much it costs to produce the electricity. Like we analyze or assess for any unit based. So this all the calculations which we have done with the help of NREL tool, National Renewable Energy Tools, we have been we come towards this concept that because we are living here Pakistan, due to absence of the technology in Pakistan, the cost parameters will be in range. But there are with the help of research and development, there are many types of the bioenergy technologies, but in Pakistan we targeted on these which you can see here, they have been highlighted. Here you can see that LCO is basically highly dependent on the full load hours or the capacity factor. It is basically by using the different technologies, then they having a different full load hours, then it will decide the LCOE cost. Basically, it is having a technology which will be a better, which is more efficient. It's mean if we run that for the more, if we use that for the more utilization, for the more full load hours, so its LCOE will be small. So production cost will be small. For the assessment of this, we have done, now coming towards our research, what we have done, we studied and we have got the result that basically we basically calculated the cost of the equipment for the bioenergy technologies based on for the simple plants as well as for the combined heat power plant, combined heat and power plant. For different equipments, you can see here there are different equipment cost per kilowatt. If we discuss towards the capital cost of any bioenergy technology, here you can see that basically the equipment cost is a very important factor in that, which is having a major role in that. But overall, if we see there are many different contributions, there are many different also factors which are including for the capital cost, which you can see here in the pie chart. A financial model, which is the results of the LCOE, levelized cost of electricity. Here you can see here, it is basically the based on technology, the value here you can on the left side of the graph, you can see the value is basically vary from 0.06 per kilowatt hour to 0.31 per kilowatt hour. The value is also very significant with the technology, but if we said, what is the major factor? What is the major factor? If we basically the feedstock is very important, which was our first objective for this potential. It is basically it can control 50% of the levelized cost. So there is basically we can provide a mechanism, the supply chain mechanism, which is important for the bioenergy market competitor. So the policy action and the milestones, there is a regulatory framework through that basically. If we, these are basically some policy actions and the milestones which can be followed for a country like Pakistan. This is basically a sustainability framework having a specific goals and the targeted years. Due to lack of the time, I'm really sorry I cannot explain and read those because the time is too short. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zulfikar, for a great presentation and work that you're doing. And I think we would be enlightened with the whole detailed paper and we'll be able to access it later on. So thank you so much. With this, in the interest of time, I don't think we would be able to a wrap up and a closing remark, and then I would request all the panelists to please stay with us for a group photo, and also we would like to present you some souvenirs and from SDPI to be able to join us, and we are very delighted to host you today. So over to you, Dr. Vakar, if you're with us.
Thank you, Dr. Hina. And apologies that I couldn't be in the hall in person. But let me start by thanking this very esteemed panel for joining us here on a very important topic, especially when countries are recovering from the pandemic. And if I just have to highlight some key takeaways from a vast set of recommendations that we had during the presentation, I think it's important to address SDG 7 even more, and that Pakistan really needs to invest in clean energy and climate resilient infrastructure. And as Mr. Ali said, that green financing is not easy to come by. We need to develop a strategic framework to remove fossil fuel subsidies, decarbonize the economy, and promote energy efficiency. Through cooperation of all the stakeholders, and I'm glad that we are partnering here with GIZ today, for which we are very grateful. It is really essential to mobilize the planning systems towards the goal of climate neutrality. And Pakistan needs to understand how it is going to build upon its opportunities of green financing, such as financial agreements recently seen between Germany and Pakistan at COP26, loans for solar PV, hydropower, and technical advice to scale up energy efficiency. From the discussions around energy transition, we learned today that Pakistan needs to put a major focus on energy efficiency and conservation measures, review its net metering policy, and consider a mechanism for cost recovery for consumers for network usage, including transmission and distribution costs and its economic assessment mechanism, and consider the levelized cost of storage for grid connected and home energy storage systems. In power system planning, the need was highlighted to better reflect operational constraints in long-term system planning and have a higher granularity for grid modeling. Further, for system planning for climate neutrality, there's a need for integrated modeling of power sector with heat, gas, and transport system. So all in all, I think this has been a very comprehensive discussion, and really hope that we can provide and connect the inputs from today's very esteemed panel and the chat that we have seen online over Zoom and our Facebook pages. We really hope to communicate it in the most succinct manner to the government. Thank you, Dr. Hina. It's back to you.
Not feeling well for today. We really wish you a quick recovery, and thank you so much for the wrap up and the concluding remarks. With this, I would like to call this session off and request our esteemed panelists for a group photo. But before that, could I request Dr. Sardar Mosen to please come forward and present the shield to Dr. Philip, who has joined us as a guest of honor for this session. So second, we would like Mr. Ali Zain. Thank you so much, Ali, to join us and enlighten us with the useful insights. Thank you so much for joining us today. Session. Thank you so much, Dr. Safwa.